Right, we're off.
I get that.
Good evening, I'm Mick Finch and I'm the BA Fine Art course leader here at CSM. Welcome to this session, Becoming Medium. It is organised by the Tableau project group at Central St Martin's. This is a follow-on from an earlier session where Philip Armstrong, Steve Melville and Michael Newman indicated some possible positions in the face of the question of what the term Tableau might offer to current context. This evening, Steve Melville will be given the paper Becoming Medium, and we will be, hopefully, or we are actually, linked by Skype to Ohio State University, where further work on Tableau is taking place in the shape of seminars, the exhibition Tableau Painting Stage, and publications. In this context, Steve recently gave the paper Dimensions of the Tableau in Columbus, Ohio, and Becoming Medium is a further elaboration of his ideas on the subject. This link to Ohio is bringing together a number of key actors in this project. The OSU Tableau project is headed up by Philip Armstrong, Lisa Florman and Laura Lisbon, and is being followed by a group of students who will be present through this link. The link many of you will recognise brings together Philip, Laura and Steve, who led the As Painting project, a major exhibition at the Wexner Centre in 2001. Many of you will also know as the landmark book that was published by MIT that mapped the complexities of what Steve would say what counts as painting in a post-war context between the USA and Europe. The essays by Steve, Laura and Philip still stand as important texts, and the translation of key texts were for many the first glimpses into the significance of French context has played in terms of questions about pictorial practice during the last few decades. The CSM Tableau project owes much of the work that As Painting has done and is well illustrated by Steve's reflection in his As Painting essay entitled Counting as Painting, where he says, acknowledgement remains open to the possibility of some things coming to be transformed beyond recognition, thus needing to find new words for this accomplishment. This would be an open limit on As Painting, a matter of not of what excludes, but of what can only be gone on to. End of quote. At CSM, we're delighted that Steve Melville is, since October of this year, a visiting professor with us. And this is his first public event in this role. In the pipeline are some further public events that you will be able to participate in. If you're not signed up to the Tableau mailing list, then please go to tablauproject.blogspot.co.uk, where you can sign up to receive information about future events. Steve is the author of a number of key works in addition to his role in As Painting, notably Philosophy Beside Itself on Deconstruction and Modernism, Vision and Textuality, which he edited and wrote a text with Bill Reddings, Seams, Art as a Philosophical Context, and recently Writing Art History, Disciplinary Departures with Margaret Iverson. This evening there will be a response to Becoming Medium from Michael Newman, who's the Professor of Art Writing at Goldsmiths. He's written extensively on contemporary art, including the books Richard Prince Untitled Couple and Jeff Wall. His collected essays are soon to be published. Right.
Collected essays,
Selected.
Still a movement which I know very well.
It is worth noting that Michael gave a paper on Tacita Dean in the As Painting Conference in 2001. His valuable contributions to the Tableau project in the Tate Conference in 2011 and the more recent session here at CSM, I think means the response to Becoming Medium is in very good hands. First, we're going to start with Steve.
Yeah. Thank you, Mick. Oh. This is technically very complicated. It feels like a little straitjacket here between Skype and the microphones. So this talk is the second, as Mick indicated, in what now looks like a sort of continuing effort to feel my way into some questions about painting. In the first of these talks, which I gave at Ohio State a while ago, and here yesterday, I offered what I take, despite a very oblique approach, I must say, I offered a kind of concrete historical claim that the term tableau comes to prominence when it does, because it offers to articulate and to address a deep gap between the emergence of painting as a medium and pictorial composition as the apparent means of its sense. This lecture is more speculative than that one, has less concrete claims, and its outcome is certainly less secure. In fact, it's been a struggle to bring this into shape, so much so that when Michael arrived earlier this evening, he found himself faced with a new last paragraph. So that said, the notion of medium played a fairly important role in that Tableau lecture. And so I'm sort of pulling that thread out and trying to explore it more fully in this sequel. So it takes up the claim made in that painting, in that lecture, that painting becomes a medium. And I want to know what that business of becoming a medium might be really about. And that includes, I assume, a host of other questions, at least some of which are not as dumb as they might sound. What was painting before it was a medium? My suggestion in the Tableau lecture was that it was a sort of conflation of sculpture and architecture. How should one understand a remark like that? Is becoming a medium something that happens to other arts? Say, for example, sculpture. If that doesn't sound right to you, and it doesn't sound right to me, then why doesn't it sound right? Are mediums in general the kind of things someone, Caravaggio, for example, invents? If that's not the right word, what is the right word? Is it something somebody discovers? Is it something that gets assumed? Assumed like a costume, or assumed like a responsibility, or assumed like a presupposition? Does speaking, as Fried does in relation to Caravaggio and some stuff I talked about yesterday, and of the gallery picture, does speaking of the violent birth, or the decisive and irrevocable emergence or coming into prominence help any? What kind of event, what kind of history should we imagine here? I want to start by recalling Fried's actual remark, let me get that off, about Caravaggio's achievement. The bit I cited in the earlier lecture was the phrase, quote, "a new material and artistic entity, a new medium of painting." The full sentence speaks of Caravaggio's Judith and Holofernes in particular as indicating or allegorizing, and again I'm quoting Fried, the violent emergence or coming into prominence of a new material and artistic entity, a new medium of painting, the self-sufficient and autonomous gallery picture. I took this perhaps wrongly as aimed at the emergence of painting as a medium more or less to court. The grammar strongly suggests that Fried may well have meant the sentence more restrictively, with the new medium being precisely the gallery picture, presumably as opposed to such other mediums than as the fresco, the altarpiece, or the easel painting. I think there are a lot of reasons, both within the Caravaggio book and in Fried's work more generally, to think that this cannot in fact be what he means. One might, I suppose, try to split the difference here and invoke a notion of the Caravagesque as embracing but also going beyond the apparent narrowness of the gallery picture. But of course, now it looks like we're simply trading format for style without making any actual headway on the notion of medium. More generally, the various notions that are getting aired here all have the same effect of apparently multiplying mediums within the very thing we're trying to get a hold of as a medium. Do we want to say that every painter or every serious painter invents a new medium? What if we say that every such painter invents the medium anew? Is that just sleight of hand? Or is it really different? What does seem clear in Freed's sentences is that it is the words self-sufficient and autonomous that justify the use of the word medium, and that gallery picture has whatever weight it can carry by virtue of that. Freed can, I think, help us only so far here. As early as Three American Painters in 1965, Freed notes of his own argument that, quote, the notion that there are problems intrinsic to the art of painting is, so far as I can see, the most important question begged in this essay. It has to do with the concept of medium, and is one of the points philosophy and art criticism might discuss most fruitfully if a dialogue between them could be established. Mostly, it seems to me that dialogue remains unestablished, and questions of medium and what might be intrinsic to it as problems, possibilities, and so on, remain obscure. It's striking within Freed's own subsequent work that even as the Caravaggio book appears to reopen a question of medium, the book on contemporary photography, which came out shortly before it, seems content to work back and forth between the term tableau and matters of absorption and theatricality without making any significant appeal to any notion of medium. There are perhaps some useful, difficult bits to be gleaned from Freed's major early philosophical interlocutor, the American philosopher Stanley Cavell, particularly because a number of Cavell's remarks seem to choose to dwell precisely within some of the ambiguities and uncertainties I've run through. The remark I'd have preside over the whole comes from an early essay, A Matter of Meaning It, where Cavell writes, the medium is to be discovered or invented out of itself. And I want to just pause over that out of. Derrida plays similarly with that notion of being out of, meaning, somewhere other than itself, and precisely from within itself. I'll supplement that remark with several more or less consecutive remarks from Cavell's book, The World Viewed, which I quoted from last time in relation to the work of Morris Louis. These are more general remarks. One might say, Cavell writes, the task is no longer to produce another instance of an art, but a new medium within it. The failure to establish a medium is a new depth and absoluteness of artistic failure. Or again, what modernist painting proves is that we do not know a priori what painting has to do or be faithful to in order to remain painting. A medium of painting is whatever way or ways paint is managed so as to create objects we accept as paintings. When such a medium is discovered, it generates new instances, not merely makes them possible, but calls for them, as if to attest that what has been discovered is indeed something more than a single work could convey. Those quotes can remind you of Freed's footnoted argument with Clement Greenberg in Art and Object, and in particular its assertions that the essence of painting, that, Freed writes, which compels conviction is largely determined by and therefore changes continually in response to the vital work of the recent past. The essence of painting is not something irreducible. Rather, the task of the modernist painter is to discover those conventions that at a given moment alone are capable of establishing his work's identity as painting. There's a lot to be digested in those quotes, so I'll start by just emphasizing 2 points. First, the notion of medium in play here seems inextricably linked to a certain imagination of modernism. Medium is, as it were, the shape painting assumes when it is no longer sustained by something called tradition. And Cavell has some nice remarks about tradition. He says, when there was a tradition, everything which seemed to count did count. The problem now, he says, is that I am, so to speak, stuck with the knowledge that this is sculpture in the same sense that any object is. The problem is that I no longer know what sculpture is, why I call any object, the most central or traditional, a piece of sculpture. The second thing I want to emphasize in these remarks is that the question of medium, say the responsibility for it, evidently goes, as one says, all the way down. It's never simply given but always at every moment, including presumably its first moment, in need of invention or discovery, and so also evidently cannot be imagined as something established at one datable moment or another. These two thoughts sit at first glance uneasily with one another. On the one hand, we're invited to imagine medium as a consequence of a particular rupture, a break with some tradition that had until that moment been in force. And on the other hand, we're asked to imagine that rupture as more or less permanent and groundless. But it should also strike us that this is just what it means for something to be self-shaped, to find or discover oneself as shaped and given, but is necessarily so shaped in relation to an otherness that makes time and desire, self-shaping and self-loss, already dimensions of that givenness, thus already broken with it. Tradition is in this sense a sedimentation of modernity, which always has the lead on it. Just as I want to say and have argued elsewhere, the classical is for Wolflin, always a sedimentation of the Baroque. Doing history, we stir up the sediment and muddy the waters. So it may be clarifying to at least take a look at the kind of history we're not doing here. We are in particular not doing the kind of history that definitively breaks apart into a history of the image before the era of art and a subsequent era in which the image is externally framed as art. Right? The word frame mattering here both as a material fact of painting, presumably, or at least some painting, and as a shorthand for a larger and more general institutional fact. That is, we're not doing the kind of history assumed by such figures as Hans Belting and Victor Stoikida, and which finds its most general philosophic justification in the work of Arthur Danto. Elements of that difference surfaced in the earlier lecture, and I don't want to expand on it here, but I do want to sort of underline the difference between a history of the image, conceived that way, and the history to which I think a term like medium will matter, which will be a history that has to define itself as of art, and that might perhaps most broadly be put as a history of the mark. So it's a history of what we might better call the plastic than the visual arts. The actual position of art history these days is another question altogether. So I want to take a moment to dwell a little bit more closely with what Fried claims for Caravaggio. He says, for example, that David with the head of Goliath allegorizes the specular moment of the handing over of painting to the realm of visuality. And I take it by that he must mean roughly that David holds Goliath's head before him in something like the way the darkness of the painting's ground holds David and Goliath, or does it hold David with the head of Goliath before us? I've tried to put that simply, but even so, there are a lot of ambiguities running around in it. For example, David is holding Goliath's head out for an audience, and my summary suggests that we are to see something like that action, that set of figures, held out toward us by the darkness of the ground. But the actual phrasing speaks of David holding the head out before himself, so it ought to be matched by a phrase that has us holding the painting before ourselves. No doubt I could straighten that out and also straighten out some of the other ambiguities that accompany it, but the point, I think, is precisely not to see the mobility of this painted allegory in which painting and specularity, artist and viewer, active and passive, the painting and the figures or action represented in it, something like the front and the back, are jointly staked and are what make the painting momentary, both in the sense of a particular moment forcefully captured and in the sense of that moment's concealing within itself, as Fried argues, a more complex temporal structure that cannot be reduced to a single moment. If we take David with the head of Goliath as our primary text, then we can perhaps now see the crowning of thorns as a further commentary on it. Specularity, now itself a dimension represented within the painting, in the play between the action and the viewer with its back turned towards us on the left, as well as a certain obstacle to the full visibility of its subject, unless we take the subject more abstractly to be something like the terms of vision's simultaneous fulfillment and bafflement. Fried cites Merleau-Ponty, who's long a touchstone of his writing, on the underlying point. Every visual something, as individual as it is, functions also as a dimension, because it is given as the result of a dehiscence of being. What this ultimately means is that the hallmark of the visible is to have a lining of invisibility in the strict sense, which makes it present as a certain absence. I'm probably more comfortable myself appealing here to Heidegger's ways of letting light and shadow figure the kinds of concealment proper to lucidity itself, and one might then also be interested by Nancy's various extensions of this thought in his dealings with image and painting. But I imagine Fried's remark is good enough to secure the point, and I hope I've given you enough to actually see it. It's certainly worth noting along the way how Caravaggio's paintings make some significant part of their sense as commentary on one another, and as a commentary that arises in a complex rotational space in which they establish their visual relation to one another. So if things like this are in Caravaggio what count as paintings becoming medium, it seems right to say that what we're dealing with in the first instance is a certain severance of the visual. It's becoming, in a word that matters to the Baroque, elliptical. They may indeed be possible only on a surface we can casually describe as two-dimensional, but which is not therefore reducible to the fact of such a surface and can't be explained solely by reference to it. For Fried, it's a matter above all of a material support and of two bodies, artist and viewer, that cannot stand in one another's presence, even when they happen to be the same body. In that way, Fried's imagination of Caravaggio is somewhat like certain accounts of Freud's consulting room, more crowded than it first appears. Here, too, it seems to me there's room to push and pull a bit at the formulations, but the sense should, I hope, be clear enough. It's a particular orientation to finitude, to having, one might say, not simply edges, but limits, that defines painting as a medium and gives it the means to make renewed sense of its already given two-dimensionality. This is a finitude often thought of in terms of either materiality or temporality, and the concern for temporality is probably the deeper of the two. It certainly has the lead in formulations like this from Jean-Luc Nancy. This completion without end, this finite finishing, if one attempts to understand thereby a completion that limits itself to what it is, but that to achieve that very thing opens the possibility of another completion, and that therefore is also an infinite finishing, this paradoxical mode of perfection is doubtless what our whole tradition demands one to think and avoids thinking at the same time. In that remark, finitude means precisely what is not closed in and on itself in the way we often imagine a term like pictorial composition to entail, but instead means that which can only be gone on from, because in its very claim to closure and identity, it is also already unfolded into, undergirded by, otherness. This is to say that the logic or the grammar of the tableau, insofar as it's to be discovered or founded in the gap between painting and its composition, is a variation on the logic of supplementarity, as we know it from Derrida, registering a dynamic internal to painting and the necessity of an inevitable passage outside or beyond it, as, for example, in the demand for another painting or for seriality, but also in an entanglement with another art. If in the earlier lecture I was trying to free up the grammar that allows the word tableau to count at certain historical moment, here's perhaps the place to note the availability of that specific word for that function, just because while already in circulation around painting, and indeed in the Renaissance it can generally simply be translated as picture, it also carried within itself the possibility of naming from within painting the theater to which it would then be bound. The actual subject of Nancy's sentence is not painting, but art. So it may now be worth noting that the language of the passage is very much that of painting, both in its concern for finish, a painterly term, and in its emphatic echoing of the painter's fecit in his hyphenation of the word perfect. I'd like to understand that a bit better, that is, understand how, under the rule of the tableau, painting becomes the medium within art that seems in some sense capable of standing for or speaking for art as a whole. I take this representativeness or asymmetry to be familiar enough to need no particular underlining. It's there, for example, in the fold that leads Heinrich Wölfflin to use the term painterly to name a crucial dimension of style across the full range of the arts. And it's there differently in Clement Greenberg's writings on sculpture in the 1950s and 60s. So I think one should want to say, or at least be tempted to say here, first, that the emergence of painting as a medium is the emergence of medium as such. And second, that painting is within art the place from which art's finitude is best thought or worked through. I think this is a way of thinking about what the Baroque is. I think Hegel offers a version of these thoughts worth spending some time with, and that's where I'm going to spend the bulk of my time. To put things too briefly, but I hope this will turn out to be clear, Hegel's philosophy of art works along two axes. One is historical, and one is oriented to the particular ways the individual arts manage the relation between form and content. How directly what he calls the individual arts answer to what we might be medium is very much a question. These two axes, the historical and the axis of the individual arts, are not fully independent. Each of the periods he distinguishes on the historical axis is dominated by one or another of the individual arts, so that we have, very schematically, something like this. Historical eras down the left, individual arts, as Hegel distinguishes them more or less, across the top. The symbolic, the earliest historic era, dominated by architecture. We'll come back to why that's the illustration I plugged in there. The classical, dominated by sculpture, as we all know. And the romantic, or as I'll frequently say, modern, dominated by painting. And again, I'll modify that in a little bit. That's, let's say, the basic schema. So what this means is, for example, and I'm going to read it in a couple of different directions, in a symbolic era, sculpture and painting are obliged to make such sense as they can on terms set by architecture. And conversely, sculpture becomes fully itself only in its classical moment. More fully fleshed out, the diagram might look like this. And I just want to point out that I've reached historically back further than Hegel does. He reaches back to the Egyptians, keeping with long-standing stories. These are all Paleolithic works. And obviously, as I hit the Romantic era, I've not only reached beyond him, but I've put in a little bit of sort of this history in there. And I'll just point out also that my instance of symbolic painting relates to Nancy's essay in the Grotto, which is going to return towards the end of the lecture. This is not the only way to fully flesh out the diagram, and I'll be offering you an alternative to it in a minute, but I think this is a good baseline for getting a feel for it. One further remark, there are dialectical wheels within wheels everywhere in this diagram. So if we look at that central moment, the moment of sculpture's classical hegemony, it too can be broken down into its own moments and arts. Right? So you have in the upper left the Herm as the symbolic and architectural moment of classic art. You have the group sculpture as the romantic carry over of classical sculpture, and relief as the painterly modernizing carryover, right? And Hegel's full 1,000-page philosophy of art runs through these wheels a lot, right? This helps make it clear, I think, that the historical terms, symbolic, classical, and romantic, are really names for moments, right? They're kind of like the moments of beginning, middle, and end, or prior, present, and belated, or early, present, and late, right? They evidently need to be set into some particular set of objects, practices, or moments to fully make sense. And they have whatever historical purchase they have on that basis. So a lot of people have a lot of trouble with the bit of Hegel that claims to be giving a universal history of art. Rightly have trouble with that. I think you can still hang on to this notion of these moments, this pastness, presentness, belatedness in there. Things I think of as matters of sort of tense and aspect as dimensions of art. Hegel doesn't stress it, but it's part of his scheme that the dominance, that each of these moments with its dominant art also contains, as a consequence of that dominance, a particular way of imagining what the whole of art amounts to. So that one will say that in the moment of architecture's symbolic dominance, the arts as a whole amount to everything's being under the same roof. Or to put it a little more exactly in Hegel's terms, the arts consist simply of one thing after another. Whereas in the moment of classical sculpture, the other arts are imagined and realized as that sculpture's further, still more outward expression. So the Greek temple just is a further expression of the sculpted God at its center. In the case of the Romantic or the modern moment, painting is the dominant plastic art, but the moment is importantly characterized by a mixed dominance that painting shares with music and poetry, which is also to say that such a moment imagines the shape of the arts as a whole as a system of the arts. And here one may indeed be sharply inclined to speak of distinct mediums as the shape the individual arts have now assumed. So this is the alternative way of trying to fill out that diagram. If one looks back from this moment to Hegel's account of architecture from within its own proper symbolic moment, it should not be entirely clear why one is obliged to call something like this architecture, since it arises from and makes itself out of an apparent confusion or conflation and running together of the arts we so easily distinguish now. And yet Hegel does want to say, and is fairly compelling in doing so, that what we have here is architecture in its independence, which is clearly not exactly the same thing as a pure architecture. You might say a purity is an ambition imposed on architecture in its modern moment, when it becomes a medium among other mediums. In this, its independent moment, architecture is as fully architecture as it ever will be, but in that shape, it does not consist of a medium, and it is not pure. In fact, in what Hegel takes to be its historically earliest form, architecture is something very close to mere measure. It's not wholly distinct from the simple surveying or articulation of an extent. Hegel cites, and this would be one of his examples, ancient Egypt. From within this moment, there is no good reason, and perhaps no reason at all, to call things of this sort architecture, and even less reason to call them art. And roughly the same thing is true of works like this within their moment. It's only from within our Romantic or modern moment that these terms, architecture, sculpture, painting, make full sense, just as it is only from within such a moment that they can be seen to have and to belong to a history. Within their proper moments, they are evidently facts of their culture. We can speak of a medium where an art finds itself knotted through itself. This is, I think, what Victor Stoikida must mean to get at in taking up the tableau in the way that he does, but he takes it up as a matter of self-awareness whereas it's more nearly a matter of self-interference, resistance to being untied, of something like the admission of an unconsciousness, an otherness at the heart of self-shapedness. You might try out the thought that what's at stake here is less a matter of an art coming to recognize itself than it's finding itself obliged to acknowledge something about itself. Self-criticism is in this sense internal to an art that is shaped like this, what renders it in a special sense historical and not simply something that changes over time. A Hegelian or significantly post-Hegelian art history finds its object as a discipline only in such knots. This is the way Hegel puts it in the introductions to his Aesthetics. Philosophy has to consider an object in its necessity, not merely according to subjective necessity or external ordering, classification, so on. It has to unfold and prove the object, test the knot, you might say, according to the necessity of its own inner nature. It's only this unfolding which constitutes the scientific, I'd say objective, element in the treatment of a subject. If we want to sound the word medium in this kind of Hegelian context, we have to push its most ordinary senses, say as referring to certain materials or a certain body of conventions or something like a channel of communication, into the background, and instead hear its proximity to such crucial Hegelian terms as mediation and middle, as for example when Hegel speaks of the syllogism and the speculative proposition, or when he speaks in the Encyclopedia of mind, nature, and logic, taking turns standing as middle to the other's extremes. In an interesting way, the system of the arts is within Hegel's philosophy a kind of first draft of what he comes to call the system in his philosophy itself, just as classical sculpture is a kind of model for him of what philosophic writing should be. Medium would then be a particular shape in which art thinks itself, and its ultimate purchase is more nearly logical or grammatical. As I understand Hegel's account of these things, and this is all highly arguable, questions of art, language, and logic, questions of measure and spacing, you might say, are very deeply intertwined from the beginning. We have art, we have that history, because thought has from the beginning a problem with language, with its foreignness to thought, say its arbitrariness, its externality, or its materiality, that it's obliged to work through in plastic terms. The individual arts are so many discrete, concrete negotiations with this. Should thought finally manage to make peace with its means of expression, art's history would come to an end. Hegel thus introduces his discussions of both symbolic art in general and architecture through discussions of the sign and language, and he goes on to take up architecture in particular as essentially processual, bound up with taking the measure of the earth in our inhabitation. Like Heidegger, he likes to pun on geometry. That's the privilege of the Egyptian temple as independent architecture over the Greek temple. As a more general thought, this tends to place the origins of art in concatenations of marks that we cannot easily sort out between, say, an engagement with visual appearance, some kind of apparatus, something like notation. I think it matters particularly to Hegel that the origins of art and of writing are bound up together, not easily distinguishable. And the sense of these marks may appear radically opaque, not simply because of historical or cultural distance, but because there is little or nothing in the marks themselves that could guide us towards any particular sense. And Whitney Davis has pushed this very, very far in looking at Paleolithic art. They are, as marks, deeply inexpressive. It's tempting to say, and Hegel pretty much does say, that these early architectural marks make the world thinkable without, as it were, actually being able to think anything in particular. The becoming medium of art is, in these terms, the art's discovery that their more determinate grasp of the world doesn't take place except through an acknowledgement of their limitations and at the cost of their dispersion. The history of art, then, is for Hegel thought's working itself all the way through to the end of the capacity discovered in such marking. That's an end he sees realized in his own mode of writing and argument. The speculative logic that, as he puts it in the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit, rigidly excludes the usual way of relating the parts of a proposition in reaching the goal of plasticity, and that he sets that as a goal for philosophic writing is, I think, very interesting. Our own position, reading Hegel, is necessarily more complex. The least we can say is that neither the history of art nor the history of thought appear to have sustained his own sense of ending. We evidently remain pledged to the finitude constitutive of art as such, and I think in any case that's the wager the artist has to make. It's the position I take Jean-Luc Nancy to be addressing in his essay, The Vestige of Art, when he speaks of art as vestige in the wake of the withdrawal of the idea, and writes, "The history of art is a history that withdraws at the outset and always from the history or historicity that is represented as a process or a progress," or again, that if the event of art completing itself and vanishing is repeated throughout its history, if such an event forms this history as the rhythm of its repetition, it's because some necessity attaches to it. So Hegel has answers, good answers, I think, to a lot of my dumb questions. But the answers turn out to be very difficult. The individual arts are for Hegel shapes of material thought, but of the visual arts at least, painting is the only one that turns out to be, as it were, specifically medium-shaped. That is, the only one that is integrally linked to a certain notion of self-criticism. The term is not generalizable, or is so only under the conditions that bring painting to the fore. That's perhaps part of what it means to say that the emergence of painting as a medium is irrevocable. The transformation it effects is in a sense global. It operates the passage to art overall. The knot tied here as painting is at the same time the knot that delivers art, both as a whole and its essential discreteness and limitation from its symbolic and broadly architectural origins. I suggest that when Nancy calls in this context, more or less following Hegel, the withdrawal of the idea, is more pointedly thought of in our contemporary context as the withdrawal or becoming unavailable of sculpture. That is, a certain recognition of the impossibility of the cultural ambition that still stands as one version of art's greatest aspiration, where the history of art would come to rest if it were not already determined to find itself in some falling away from that idea. So for Hegel, classical art still is the high point of art's history. There's something kind of right about that. It's art, if anything is. For Hegel, in the end, art really isn't something. This is to say that art as art, modern art, is bound to make itself out of a certain play between its incipience and its decline. Out, that is, of an uneasy oscillation between symbolic and romantic, between independent architecture and painting. I think this is maybe the deepest ground against which the term tableau takes on its necessity in its moment. It will also have been the ground against which the term composition will have taken on its own necessity in a rather different Renaissance moment that implicitly pitted the visibility of the image against the legibility of a narrative. There is in this sense neither beginning nor end to the becoming medium of painting. It is what painting is. So let's say that what is possible now is for art to begin and for art to end. What we may want to call its post-medium condition is better thought of as something resembling, even repeating, the conditions of independent or symbolic art. This is how we might in general think of such practices as installation, relational art, and so on. It would also be how we might think of the hold of the art world on our imagination of art, and so also the kind of history that I think are now best captured by the notion of visual culture that it subtends. And it leaves painting as a medium to test itself not against pictorial composition as the means of its sense, the older project of the tableau, but face to face with the claims of the image, which is to say face to face with the shape of its own presence. Jean-Luc Nancy has been an intermittent presence throughout this lecture and the previous one, both because of his specific readings of Hegel in the speculative remark and the restless of the negative, and in his writings on history. I'm thinking particularly here of the essays Finite History and Sharing Voices, and on art, primarily in his little book, The Muses. All those places he makes arguments particularly close to some of the things I've been exploring. In particular, I've quoted several times now from his essay, The Vestige of Art. There's one particular bit of a closely related essay in The Grotto, Painting in the Grotto, that has over the years especially interested me, both because it represents a strong convergence of interest and because I've never been wholly satisfied with the way it brings together questions of image and painting. In it, he asks the reader at one point to imagine the unimaginable, the gesture of the first imager. And in the course of Nancy's fleshing out of that imagining, this first imager gets quietly, and I think problematically, renamed the painter. Here's a little bit of what he writes as he's trying to draw the reader into his imaginary Lascaux or Casquet. He says, for the first time, he, the first imager, touches the wall not as a support, nor as an obstacle or something to lean on, but as a place, if one can touch a place. Only as a place in which to let something of interrupted being, of its estrangement, come about. The rock wall makes itself merely spacious, the event of dimension and of the line, a spacing which to let come, in which to let come all the presence of the world. This is presumably part of a moment meant to stand for the birth of art. But now when I read it, I hear in a way I had not before the kind of presence of architecture. And so it strikes me as a description of the studio in which our questions are now posed. Questions that, whether or not they are adequately borne by the word tableau, are, I think, fundamentally about what painting makes of its time. That's where I'll stop. I lost track of the slides. That was to go with the studio.
Yeah, that's still up. Philip, you okay?
They're laughing in Ohio State. Where's the, is there a plug here somewhere? I can use just, well, just in case.
How much juice have I got left?
No, your juice is more important than my juice.
It is.
Don't worry.
How much have you got? You're fine.
I'm probably okay. I'm just being, no, I've got plenty of juice. I'm all juiced up.
There's Ohio down in the lower left.
Am I amplified? Not yet.
Yeah, you're fine.
Am I?
Yeah, you're in. Yeah.
No, I don't think I'm.
You are. It's not so much going out there, it's
Oh,
going into the
oh,
corner.
okay.
Okay? They're still there.
Can you all hear?
Yeah.
Hello, Ohio.
Hello, Michael.
Hi. Do you need me to point this up? To move this like this?
No.
No,
You're
it's
good.
okay, is it? Yeah? No, I mean them. Oh, strange. That was an incredibly rich paper, and one of the, I think, tremendously admirable things about it is the way that Stephen moves from the incredibly specific and precise to the vast kind of history of not only art but being itself. And he has a turn of phrase that I notice, having read this paper already and having read the paper that he gave before. He has this phrase that something matters, X matters, or what does it mean for something to matter? And I take it that the question that lies behind the paper is why does painting matter? Or what is it that makes painting matter for us, as well as for the other moments in the history when it was created? And obviously that question implies that it might not matter, you know, the sort of worry that painting might not matter. And really, my kind of broad thesis, I guess, is something like the question of medium arises when painting might not matter. You know, it's a kind of retroactive projection. And it depends on the possibility of painting not mattering. I'm not saying that painting doesn't matter. I think it matters and I love painting. But that question can arise is the condition of possibility, I think, for the thinking of medium as such. So I think there's a real difference between, you know, what medium might have meant for Caravaggio and what Caravaggio's painting as medium might mean for us. Because maybe the sense of medium will have changed between the time when it emerges and the time when it's in question, okay? Now, what I'm going to do is not so much give a sort of a paper as a response, but rather comment on certain moments in Stephen's presentation. So, you know, what I have to say are essentially kind of marginalia to his paper, and as a result, I won't be showing slides or any other kinds of material. Stephen asks, what was painting before it was a medium? Which I think is an important question. We tend to think of post-medium, but what about pre-medium? And in terms of the my questioning just previously, could we go further and ask what was a medium before it was a medium? End of that paragraph. What kind of event, I mean, in relation to the violent birth or decisive and irrevocable emergence of coming into prominence that Fried speaks of in relation to the picture in Caravaggio, what kind of event, Stephen asks, what kind of history should we imagine here? And also, I think that raises the question of what do we understand by event? Is an event something caused, or does it take place in relation to nothing? Is the event some kind of void, as Badiou would think it, or some kind of creation from nothing? For a painting to be an event, does it mean that it's, at some level, a creation from nothing? Now, with the romantic notion, of originality, the theological idea of creation is applied to art. Although the idea of inspiration is not exactly from nothing, precisely something is breathed in. As Levinas says, it always involves a dimension of passivity, the idea of inspiration. The source of the inspiration may be divinity or it may be nature, as it is for Kant. Does medium then, and in relation to this kind of romantic construction of the notion of originality, does medium then have a transcendental relationship to the artwork as its condition of possibility? So the invention or creation or discovery or eruption of a medium, in a way, trumps the creation of the artwork. It's even more original. You know, if a medium is a condition of possibility for a painting, to create a medium or to the coming into being or eruption of a medium is a more fundamental level, if you like, of originality. In which case, you know, I would speculate, is the post-medium condition then a kind of atheism with respect to this configuration? Okay. Stephen says, mostly, talking of Fried again, mostly that dialogue remains unestablished and questions of medium and what might be intrinsic to its problems, possibilities, and so on, obscure. Perhaps, you know, a question might be where possibility is located, or whether the question of medium is a question of possibility at all. For example, we might, following Deleuze and Agamben, distinguish potentiality from possibility. That might take us away from the transcendental status of medium, if medium has such a status, which maybe Stephen would want to argue that it doesn't, but let's say hypothetically it does. It might take us away from that to the relationship between potential and contingency. So medium would have something to do with that relation between potential and contingency. And I think it's very interesting that that in the following sentence, Stephen draws attention to Fried's book on contemporary photography and says the book on contemporary photography seems content to work back and forth between Tableau and matters of absorption and theatricality without significant appeal to notions of medium. And I think that also brings us precisely to questions of contingency, which are unavoidable in photography. Is photography a medium at all, in fact? Is it a medium, if it is it a medium in some fundamentally different way to the way in which painting is a medium? Jeff Wall writes that photography cannot have a modernist that is a medium-specific reflexive moment like painting. For example, because its surface is not essential to it. So drawing attention to its surface would not be the same kind of reflexive move that it is for painting. But I would argue that photography also has a different relation to contingency and therefore to potential. Artists like Liz Duchesne, who is currently on show in Campoli Presti, are precisely bringing the contingency of photography into painting, or painting into the contingency of photography, whichever way you like to look at it, in that she makes paintings that are essentially photographs in the process of developing, so the chemical process of development and how that takes place is the way that the, in inverted commas, painting or photograph is produced. is there such a thing as a hybrid medium? The idea of medium specificity, which Stephen is not really talking about here, but I'm thinking more of Greenberg, obviously, seems precisely an attempt to guard against such a possibility. Okay. The medium is to be discovered or invented out of itself. We're talking about Cavell here. What does it mean? What does out of itself mean here? And surely discovery and invention are rather different in this respect. Another Cavell quotation, one might say that the task is no longer to produce another instance of an art, but a new medium within it. The failure to establish a medium is a new depth and absoluteness of artistic failure. I wonder whether you can produce a new medium within an art. And why do I wonder that? I would speculate that you could have many arts and one medium, or one art and many mediums. Of course, to say this, I'm changing the sense of medium. Many arts, when there are many arts, or were many arts, say from the classical period to the Baroque, all contribute to the same project of getting from one place to the other, or one place to another, getting the viewers or the community from one place to another, say to heaven. So I'm using a medium in the sense that we still have it of spirit medium, you know, a mediation between realms. You know, and in some way, I think, you know, if one is looking at the medium before the medium becomes a problem, that's in a way what a medium is. It's a way of getting from one place to the other, a way of getting your community or congregation to heaven, say. And that idea is still preserved in the idea of the spirit medium. I discussed this in an essay on James Coleman's MIT project, written with Rebecca Comey, which is in the current Reina Sophia catalogue of James Coleman. It's called Ghostly Medium, and it looks at photography in relation to that idea of what a medium might be. Or if you have one kind of category, overarching category of art, you could have then many mediums within it, each of which might become a different way of making art. And I think this is the question raised by Thierry Dadouve in his book, Kant After Duchamp, where the aesthetic proposition is that this is art rather than this is beautiful. And the idea of art in general emerges, and the artist in general, rather than, say, a painter, merging between Duchamp and conceptual art, and forming the idea that we now have of the interdisciplinary artist, which the Goldsmiths MFA is supposed to be based on. But there you go. This would mean that the idea of medium specificity is dialectically related to non- or post-medium art, with the common identity being art in general. So I'm saying the question of medium becomes a question when the idea of art in general emerges. And the idea of medium specificity doesn't really make sense, except in relation to that idea of art in general, which also generates the notion of the artist in general, the post-medium artist, or the interdisciplinary artist. I would say these two configurations, which appear to be opposed to each other, are, in fact, in a sense, identical. So perhaps the answer to what comes before medium is precisely the post-medium condition. In order to say this, one would have to distinguish between the identification of a historical moment when a medium supposedly emerges, say, painting with Caravaggio, and the moment when worrying about the idea of medium begins. The identification of the emergence of medium, I think, doesn't make sense except from a position of worrying about medium, which means that it's retrospective and retroactive. In a sense, the history of art is transformed from the position of worrying about medium, which is identical with the moment of the emergence of the post-medium condition. That's what I'm trying to argue. You may think I'm totally wrong, and we can discuss that, but I'm throwing that speculation out. And indeed, Stephen says, medium is, as it were, the shape painting assumes when it's no longer sustained by something called tradition. To locate medium in the imagination of modernism is indeed, I think, to imply its retroactive force. The story of art is rewritten as the history of mediums. This also raises the question of the status of history in relation to now. And in that respect, I'm not going to go discuss in detail Stephen's discussion of Hegel, which I thought was immensely helpful, but only to remark on the broad sense in which it raises the question of history as a problem. So the question not only of history in relation to now, but indeed whether history even has any role at all in how contemporary works of art are made and responded to. If medium replaces tradition, as Stephen suggests, how is the historicity of medium different from the historicity of tradition? Or is medium not historical in some fundamental way? And when I say not historical, I'm thinking here of the way one of my teachers in the past, the philosopher Michel Arre, described Earth in Heidegger's Origin of the Work of Art as the non-historical in relation to the strife with and withdrawal from historical worlds, the non-historical condition of history, in other words. And I'm also thinking, as well as this idea of medium as a kind of non-historical condition of history, I'm also thinking of the way in which, for many young artists and art students today, the history of art seems totally irrelevant to their practice. Does geography, for example, replace history in the global world? Perhaps what we call art now is just a totally different kind of practice to what Michael Fried would call art. And I'm not saying this with either approval or disapproval. It's just really something that I occasionally wonder about, being committed to history myself in many ways. Another question in relation to the difference between medium and tradition is what you as a receiver do with the objects, and I mean this in the broad sense. Such an object may not have to be a physical object, do with the objects of art. Gadamer, the philosopher of hermeneutics, shows that interpretation is a matter of tradition as a kind of necessary and irreducible prejudice. We can't interpret without some kind of relation to tradition. So we could say that what we do with an art object that refers to tradition as its background is we interpret it. So it, in a sense, posits the subject of that artwork is posited as an interpreter. I don't think that medium is something that we interpret. We don't interpret medium when we're confronted by a medium-based work. I guess we could do, but I think our relationship is different, or the subject that it posits is different. We experience it, we respond to it, we situate ourselves in relation to it as a beholder or as a body, which is why a philosopher like Merleau-Ponty is very congenial to a conception of art based on the notion of medium rather than on the notion of, say, interpretation. Although I think there's Merleau-Ponty is more complicated than that. There is a dimension in relation to interpretation in his thought. Perhaps the counterpart, as I say, perhaps the counterpart to medium as object is response as phenomenological. That the emergence of phenomenology in art criticism is tied to the idea of the work of art being fundamentally to do with medium. Interesting things happen, I think, when art mixes the two, that is, mixes the relation to medium with interpretation. I keep invoking James Coleman in this, but thinking about this as a result of Stephen's paper made me realize that that is precisely what Coleman's work is about. It's about the relationship between how you're trapped as an interpreter and how you physically relate to the tableau of, say, the tape slide. And the two are not necessarily the same. The one can subvert the other. He produced a work which he refuses to allow to be reproduced. It was reproduced once, and which was in an essay that I wrote in 1985 for the Renaissance Society in Chicago on James Coleman's work, and sort of accidentally they did a reproduction. It put a reproduction in the catalogue to his fury. He doesn't like having his work reproduced. And what Connemara landscape is a kind of linear figure. It's a single slide projection which produces a white linear configuration which has the suggestion that it might just represent something, but you can't quite tell. And the first time he showed this to me, I think it was 1983, in his studio in Dublin, I was kind of looking at this thing, and I was determined to see, to interpret it in a sense, to see what it was. And so I thought, something that looks a bit like a house, and then, I couldn't quite figure out what it was. And I spent about 20 minutes looking at it, and then I thought, well, maybe it's anamorphic. So I kind of looked from the side, it's a projection on a screen, so I was kind of looking from the side to see if it was like, Holbein's Ambassadors, and the image would sort of appear, and I looked from the other side, and I looked from below, and kind of nothing. It didn't really unfold what it was to me. And then I kind of, after 20 minutes of this, I said, maybe it's writing. So I tried to work out, is it a script? And what if it was a script, could I see any words in it? And he sort of chuckled, and he said, maybe, but maybe it's not English. So, I never sort of figured it out. And then I realized the whole thing was a trap. It was precisely to put me in this position in relation to it, which was simultaneously the position of interpreter, but also the position of how you relate to something in a medium. I was kind of looking at it for its materiality. I was looking at it from different directions. As a body, I was relating to it, as a body, as a gaze, but also as an interpreter. So it then provoked a sort of reflection on how it trapped me in a particular position or placed me in a particular position. And then, of course, you reflect on the title, Connemara Landscape. There are some hints about landscape, and you realize, perhaps what the problem is, was that I couldn't occupy the position that would make clear what it was. I couldn't occupy the world of this image or whatever it was. So in a sense, I was both sucked in and excluded, in the sense that, you know, say coming to the west of Ireland from a metropolitan centre, I might kind of romanticize the Connemara landscape, and I could never occupy the position of somebody who lived in the hardship of that landscape. So there was also a political point and a historical point to be made with that work, which was a kind of tableau, but precisely combined this idea of interpretation and experience, phenomenological experience. Okay, so that was a little digression, or a long digression. Responsibility for medium goes, as one says, all the way down. It is never simply given, but always at every moment, including its first moment in need of invention or discovery. I'm quoting Stephen. And so also evidently cannot be imagined as something established at one datable moment or another. This suggests to me the idea of the continuous creation of medium, which also implies, I think, a relation of the historical and the non-historical. And it seems, too, to echo the theological notion of the divine continuous creation of the world, that there is a God who does this continuous creation, is taken up by Descartes. Descartes argues for the notion of continuous creation. He thinks that every moment of a duration is separate from every other moment, and what links the moments in a duration is the God of continuous creation. Why does he do this? In order to reconcile, at least one of the reasons is in order to reconcile causality and freedom, so that we're not determined by causality, just as God has a role in the continuous creation of the world. The idea that the artist is responsible not just for his or her works, but for the medium as that which makes individual works possible, takes the idea, takes the idea of originality, as I've already suggested, even further than it goes in Romanticism. The poet writes original poetry using the resources of language, but does not reinvent the language as such, or perhaps not until language becomes a medium in its spacing with Mallarmé. Where Rosalind Krauss talks of inventing a medium, it is the individual artist that invents a medium for themselves, and in a sense patents it. It's not for anyone else. The invented medium is not, as it seems, taken up and developed to form a tradition or set of conventions that are handed on to other artists. Dermot Costello talks about this in a very excellent article on Rosalind Krauss. But Stephen here seems to be talking about a medium more like painting than, say, James Coleman's tape slide or Ed Ruscha's automobile, which is why it seems more like perhaps the idea of theological continuous creation. To analogize Descartes, it sounds like the idea of continuous creation suggests that every painting is distinct from every other painting, analogous to the moments of duration in Descartes, that they are not copies, they don't follow a traditional model like the icon, they're not generated by tradition or within a tradition, but what makes them paintings is the reference to their continuous creation of the medium. So each individual painting is overdetermined as created both by the free act of the artist and by the medium, the two being reconciled in this continuous creation or continuous invention of the medium. The comparison with Descartes, I think, is revealing because Descartes aims to establish certainty on the ground of the subject, independently of and in rejection of tradition as the source of knowledge. He has to have recourse to continuous creation in order to re-establish continuity on a basis that would replace tradition and be reconcilable with the freedom of the subject, the basis of the doubt through which he seeks to establish what is certain, the freedom of the subject to doubt and establish certainty on itself. The subject is free to doubt everything and shown to be free in that act of doubting. To be more specific to our topic, it seems to me that Stephen squares the circle of Rosalind Krauss's problem of calling a medium something that is confined to an individual artist by saying that the reinvention of the medium actually happens all along. I'm just going to find my place. All mediums are continuously being reinvented in every instance of them. This also means that the medium is always already post-medium. The post-medium condition names the condition of every medium that has to continuously restart itself. And each restarting will retroactively establish the continuity that in effect replaces tradition. Stephen, I think, says as much in the next paragraph in the remarkable phrase that tradition is, in this sense, a sedimentation of modernity. Okay, to move on. To quote Stephen again, to say that in this mobile painted allegory, painting and specularity, artist, we're talking about the head of Goliath, David holding Goliath's head. Artist and viewer, active and passive, the painting and the figures or action represented in it, something like front and back, are jointly staked, are what makes the painting momentary, both in the sense of a particular moment forcefully captured and in the sense of that moment's concealing within itself a more complex temporal structure that cannot be reduced to a single moment. Stephen draws a suggestion about temporality from the relation between the action in Caravaggio's David with the head of Goliath and what the painting does in terms of visibility and darkness, which suggests to me the idea of the movement or temporality of disclosure in Heidegger, which is also the relation of the moment to a more complex temporal structure that cannot be reduced to a single moment. It also, of course, recalls a whole tradition of thinking about temporality, which probably goes back to St. Augustine and certainly would include Husserl's lectures on internal time consciousness. The implications of this are so huge I can really only point to it. The distinction between linear temporality and phenomenological temporality, the question of the relation of event to its situation, etc., etc. From our point of view, we might want to think of its implications for temporality of the tableau, the stilling, the tableau as a stilling, the stilling that allows for another kind of movement to come to the fore. Okay, now I want to turn to the question of finitude and the infinite, which is raised by Stephen's quotation of that marvelous passage from Jean-Luc Nancy, where he talks about finite finishing and infinite finishing. And Stephen then refers to the question of finitude and what finitude might mean. The distinction between finite finishing and infinite finishing in Nancy is, I would take it as a reference to Levinas. I would take it as a reference to Levinas's distinction between totality and infinity, or at least had that distinction kind of lying behind it in the book of that name, which is, I would say, why, as Stephen suggests, it opens up to the other, though in Nancy's case and Stephen's case, to another art. In Levinas, this involves the relation, or better, non-relation, or relation without relation, non-relation, of being to the transcendence of the otherwise than being of the otherness of the other that makes an ethical demand on us, the unmediatable character of the relation with the other. A figure of this for him, of Levinas, is the face of the other, the face that overflows its form and thereby makes an ethical demand on me, the form being that which I project in a sort of Husserlian sense, in an intentional act. The other overflows the intentional act. In this sense, finitude just is the relation to the infinite, the openness to the infinite. I think Levinas would say that this cannot be manifest in art without art effacing itself here. The danger for him would be, art reduces the relation to the other to the idol, and the image would be also a question, perhaps, in this. And I think Stephen might say the danger is the image in relation to which painting must resist being reduced, doubled, or reduced to an echo of itself. Okay, here I want to just turn briefly to the privileging of painting. Stephen says, I think one would want here to say first that the emergence of painting as a medium is the emergence of medium as such, and second, that painting is within art the place from which its finitude is best thought or worked through. How is this different from a traditional hierarchy of the arts with, say, painting as more intellectual than sculpture as manual? How to avoid, if painting is privileged, how to avoid something that may be even more privileged than painting, trumping it in some sense, as obviously it does in Hegel, with philosophy. Is to privilege painting asking for it to be trumped in some way? That's perhaps just a little provocation. So onto the sentence here, which I think is a great formulation, where Stephen says, we can speak of medium where an art finds itself knotted through itself. Art is knotted through itself as a kind of otherness at the heart of self-shapedness, self-shapedness. This takes us back to the remarks, I think, on finitude. How other is the otherness in this knot? What kind of otherness is it, and what kind of structure is it that gives rise to this otherness? Is it an other like a grit in the pearl? Or is it the other in the Levinasian sense of ethical otherness? Or is it a structure, and I think it's closer to that, a structure like that which Jacques Lacan calls extimity, playing on intimacy, where the inside is constituted in relation to an outside that it cannot assimilate, a kind of traumatic kernel, but also amoeba strip or a Klein bottle, or these kind of topographic figures in Lacan. So that this structure just is the subject, and it indeed takes the form for Lacan, the structure, the subject of a knot. The knot structure is also a way of replacing the structure of the relation of ground to that which it grounds, or of temporal priority, which might be in play in ideas of formed matter or order coming out of chaos. The real does not precede the imaginary, which does not precede the symbolic. They're all knotted together, undo the knot, and they're all undone or fall apart. And I'm not sure that this knot structure, which I think is a very suggestive one in this respect, is compatible with the Hegelian idea of dialectic, perhaps because there's no identity of identity and difference, which of course also creates a problem of transition and brings us back to the notion of continuous creation, the knot continuously undone and reknotted? What do we do when we lose the notion of history as the history of the transitions? What kind of history can we then construct? Okay, I'm getting towards the end now. Okay, another Hegelian moment, the withdrawal or becoming unavailable of sculpture. I thought that was a very suggestive formulation. The withdrawal or becoming unavailable sculpture is also a question of the body, of sensuousness, whether that sensuousness is in relation to the pre-sculptural moment of architecture or the sensuous embodiment of the idea as that which classical art most closely approximated. For Hegel, is the withdrawal of sculpture then art becoming a thing of the past, as I think Stephen suggests in a way? So then painting is already art after art in the Hegelian sense. Is that belatedness, and I'm just in a sense paralleling here perhaps the speculations of the thoughts of Stephen, is that belatedness a continuation of its self-criticality, that it does not embody the idea that we have embodiment on one side, post-classical sculpture, and the idea on the other, philosophy? Would Tableau then be painting addressing itself to philosophy? The tableau would then be where the idea becomes an enigma or a riddle, which the philosopher speaks back to, but without ever solving. And I think this is precisely the scenario of Raul Ruiz's film, The Hypothesis of the Stolen Painting, where the philosopher is a figure for the philosopher, then author and artist Pierre Klusovsky, and which I showed an extract from at the Tate in an earlier manifestation of the Tableau project. Okay, now I had a response to the last sentence of the paper that Stephen has now cut, and it would be unfair of me to read out that last sentence, so I won't. Don't worry, I won't. I'll allow you to try to reconstruct it from my response before I go on to the actual end of the paper. Okay, so the response is this because the tableau is not necessarily of painting? We can equally have a tableau vivant, which may be in or out of art, in a domestic setting or a pornographic review, or a tableau in theatre, Brecht, or a photographic tableau, say Raylander, or a tableau in cinema, Godard, Pierre Zucker, Werner Schröter. Does Stephen make his last remark because for him painting is a medium, whereas the tableau is not? It would be a kind of means within a medium. Or is a tableau a kind of heterogeneous medium, a medium within mediums that cuts across them and creates hybrids? That the tableau is always impure. There is no pure means. A simulacrum rather than an idea, and in relation to the God of continuous creation, something fundamentally demonic. So there I'm wondering, I think I'm wondering or speculating, why in the account of why painting matters or should matter, there seems to be a move on Stephen's part away from the tableau, a kind of rejection of the tableau as a way of thinking about painting, that painting ultimately needs to be thought about as medium rather than as tableau, and there's some sort of difference between the two. So that's really what I'm speculating here, that the unpinned down ability of tableau and its demonic simulacral character. And in saying demonic simulacral character, I'm more or less quoting Klosowski on the Tableau. There's something that disturbs this question of medium. Now to get to the actual, the actual conclusion on cave painting, on the place of cave, the first imager in the cave, as in the citation from Jean-Luc Nancy. Imager implies, I think, negativity. That in the cave, there is the coming to presence, but that coming to presence depends on, in a sense, a negative being that is the imager, the human being as imager. I mean, it would be quite close in this sense, I think, to Bataille on Lascaux, in fact. That the human introduces this terrible negativity, in a sense. Although I'm not, obviously Nancy doesn't quite put it like that. A kind of non-being in being is the condition for the manifestation or presencing. Now, where does this cave stand in relation to the story? It seems to go right back to the beginning. What was painting before it was a medium? This seems almost like a kind of answer to that, and not at the same time. The discussion of Caravaggio, drawing on Fried, stresses the emergence of the gallery painting, the painting separated from the wall in order to create a sort of framed spacing where manifestation can be shown, the head detaching itself, or being detached, being decapitated from the body, that's the painting from the wall. So the gallery painting. The tableau then is a kind of composition of bodies. So with gallery painting, tableau. Stephen takes the description of the cave to be a description of the studio, which I think is extremely interesting and indeed provocative, as an originary space, as an originally place of spacing and presencing. But also, of course, the studio is not a cave. It's a social institution. Think of Courbet's painting of the studio. There's a kind of society in the studio. The studio is a very social place in that respect. And it's a social institutional place in which one way of life or mode of being is posed against another. Say, allowing things to manifest themselves from themselves as against totalized instrumentalization and economization, just hypothetically. But in a sense, the two are not necessarily separable. So the cave in that, and the studio in that sense, is an origin, but it's an origin that depends on it being also a negation of the instrumental relation to things, in which another kind of relationship to things, or to making things, or to painting, becomes possible. So that's really the end of my remarks. How are we going to do this? I just want to get some water.
Hey, thank you, first of all. Michael said a lot, and a lot I need to think about, so I'll just reply briefly to a couple of things that he came down. And certainly the one I most want to respond to is the remark about medium becoming an issue under a post-medium condition, right? And the suggestion that sort of the emergence of medium in Caravaggio might be an emergence that doesn't care about medium, as it were, in the way we have come to. That seems to me right. And it's something I am trying to find a good way to say. So I don't think we're at odds over that point. We may be a little bit at odds over whether sort of Caravaggio and now is one moment or two moments. I want to say it's one moment. And that is clearly related to a whole string of, I think, very smart comments about history, about originality, about continuous creation. He cited Descartes there, but Fried very famously prefaces Art and Objecthood with a quote from Jonathan Edwards, which is about continuous creation. It seems to me Nancy, in this essay, Sharing Voices, that I just mentioned right at the end of the lecture, picks an argument with Gadamer that is also an argument about something very close to this. Whether the position is inherently theological, and what one would mean by theological there, seems to me very much a question, but the pertinence of the question is to me absolutely clear. I would just say, since he brought up Gadamer, who came and went from various drafts of this talk as I was working on it, Gadamer argues very clearly in arguments that are closely related to what we're discussing here, that questions of interpretation, which is what he's interested in, only arise when something in the normal mechanism of meaning has broken. So we stand interpretively towards the past when we believe that that past is no longer ours, when it has become other in some way. The fact that we can succeed in interpretation means that for Gadamer, the break that has motivated us is not deep. The ongoing underlying fact is tradition. Modernity is, in that sense, opening the question up very quickly, illusory. I am more or less committed, and it's a difficult road to hoe, which is part of what Michael was pointing out, to the Nancy argument back, which is no, the rupture goes down all the way at every moment. It's tradition that is illusory. It's modernity that is the real chain of how things hold together. And then the question of how they hold together, right, the continuous creation question, comes in with a vengeance. So I think there's a sense in which we agree about what's going on here. Closely related to that is the question of originality. And I think it's interesting, again, as I've been hashing through this lecture, which was a struggle, that one of its endings, maybe, at least at one point it seemed like it was going to be an ending, was this scene in Kant, where he, in effect, invites you, Kant doesn't tell stories, but he gives you the opening to imagine a certain kind of classroom studio situation where presumably you have a bunch of students sitting around copying a work. Right? And the teacher's going from student to student saying, oh, that's good, oh, pay a little more attention to how that shadow's there, whatever. And then he comes to one student, and what he says is evidently on a different axis entirely. He says something like, oh, that's kind of promising. Right? So that's the moment where something like originality intrudes in Kant. And I think it's a very interesting moment. And I think it's interesting to imagine a teacher saying about a work, that's promising. Right? Because the originality, and then Kant does say this, right, is all the other students are taking it that the rule for art is given in the work they're copying. That's why they're copying it. But this student is doing something that's producing a rule for art. That's what originality means there. And that's, I think, a very interesting moment to try and work through and work out what's going on in it. And I think that's part of the question that was being raised there. Much more quickly, just a couple of other things. I'm afraid Michael might be right in his closing remarks about the Tableau. I don't think he is, but I worry about it. And I think his sense that there's an unsteadiness in whether I want to sort of sustain myself with the Tableau or kind of retreat from it into medium. That's probably fairly said. The knot thing we could talk about a lot, but he's right to pick up the Lacanian knot as sort of where that bit of my thinking kind of appeals to. I don't want to reduce it to a Lacanian knot, but that model is certainly relevant in the question of its relation to the sort of truncated Hegelian dialectic that I'm trying to work with is absolutely pertinent. I do want to say one thing about knots that I'm sort of acutely conscious of and keep wanting to make count, and I don't know how to make it count. But any of you who knit know that knitting is nothing more than the repeated making of a knot, right? And that whole fabric is a knot. I think that sense of the knotability and of the relation between, say, something like knot and something like dialectic, the capacity to produce a fabric, is interesting. I'd say Hegel is like, he thinks the history of art is you've knitted almost all the sweater, and then it turns out, you were following the wrong pattern and the whole knot dissolves. It tests so far, and then it unravels. So the knot model is an interesting one to play around with. The thought also, painting is art after art, comes back to the post-median condition and the relation between the two conditions. And again, we have things to talk about, but I don't think we have an argument around that. So that touches at least a couple of Michael's points. And then there's a lot I just need to digest more. So I hope that seems an adequate response right away.
Perhaps I could just quickly come back to something that occurs to me with respect to the question of originality. I think what you say about Kant, originality at the level of the invention of the rules rather than simply playing the game, is right. And then my thought is, well, what happened with the advent of originality as a criterion for art? What does it replace? It replaces, if you like, the classicism of the academy, where the ideal is perfection. That you copy in order to approach the perfection of Greek art. So you have academic perfection being replaced by very schematically a kind of originality, which is perhaps a romantic position. But Nancy brings back perfection. He doesn't stay with originality. So there's a problem with originality. There's a problem perhaps with the idea of the subject that originality might relate to, with the idea of that sort of notion of creation even all the way down, and that the perfection is becomes some kind of relationship between the finite and the infinite, rather than the copy approaching something which is perfect. So it's an infinite sort of task in which the subject, or in which the subject is then opened up to its kind of finitude. I'm not quite putting it right. You know Nancy probably better than I do. And you mentioned this kind of the play on the notion of perfection. And it really strikes me that actually there's a kind of rejection of the notion of originality there. Or maybe not rejection, but displacement of it.
Displacement, I would say. And we're getting into mucky stuff here because we're going to be slinging around Kant and Hegel and Nancy all at once.
It's important because the art, the questioning of originality that has taken place in art, there's a kind of parallel in terms of what Nancy is doing.
Yeah. I want to answer this. there has been a questioning of originality in relation to art. How, oops, our Skype is on reserve battery power. It just beeped at us.
Oh, I didn't turn it on.
Our Skype is off of reserve power and is okay. I think we probably need to have a longer conversation about how deep and serious the questioning of originality in art has actually been. And so what the originality in question actually is. Right?
I would agree.
I would say that is sort of doubly true of the concomitant critique of genius. So I think there's less of an issue there than there may appear. It's interesting that in Kant, one way to describe the difference between the two students is the students who are doing a good job of copying presumably see that what's in front of them, this is why it would matter to Kant, is a beautiful painting, right? Not perfect, beautiful, right? And the more wayward student who's doing something promising, evidently, and Kant's language says this pretty strongly, is experiencing that same thing as sublime. That's funny, right? And that's the play of infinite and finite in Kant there, and how it's being managed becomes a whole question of its own. So I
There's also the relation between possibility and potential.
Possibility and potential, because you might say a promise in ordinary life, you know, there are things I can promise you, but you cannot take that promise seriously, right? It is not a promisable item. I can't love you forever. I can't promise that, right? And I can make promises, but unless I make them to you and you recognize them as promises, they're not in fact made, right? So the statement that that's promising, it's a really interesting kind of statement. Yeah. And it's tied to my sense that the kind of discovery or invention we're talking about is one that stands in need of some kind of securing, is not automatically anything.
It could be original nonsense.
It could be original nonsense, as Kant says. And that's kind of crucial because it happens a lot in that classroom, right? Not all of the things that are said to be promising get delivered on, right? And what they are promising is when they are promising is an interesting question. One other thing I just forgot to say in my first round, the relation to Levinas that Michael put very much in the foreground, and he certainly knows Levinas better than I do, but the question of face, of image, of idol, there's a line of concern in here that has to be answerable to that. So he's pointing to something that I know needs more address than I've been able to give it.
Thanks. I think we should open up to discussion by the audience as well.